Well, hello, and welcome to another Discover Headless Tech interview from headlesscreator.com. I am Marcelo Lewin, the Headless Creator. As always, there you go. Get a hold of me, Marcelo, at headlesscreator.com. For those of you watching live, thank you so much. For those of you listening on our podcast everywhere, thank you as well. Today's conversation is going to be all about GraphQL. We're going to give you an overview, and we're going to talk about its challenges and benefits in the enterprise. My guest is Jamie Barton. He's a full-stack web developer who specializes in building web apps using Node.js, React, and of course, GraphQL. But before we get started, you know how this works. I'm going to tell you real quick about headlesscreator.com. If you have an account, thank you so much. If you don't have an account, please go get it. Once you get your account there, it's 100% free. You'll have access to all of our courses and lessons and blog articles and podcast episodes. We got tons of stuff you can see. Just go there. You'll have access to the courses, and you can see all the courses we have. And of course, for those of you listening, you can't see this, just go to headlesscreator.com. But you'll have access to the Content Modeling Weekly course, which of course, that's where I geek out because I love content modeling. Then I have a whole bunch of focus on courses on a variety of headless CMSs. Then the Discover Headless Tech course, which is also not just the podcast, but it's also a course to discover new technologies via lessons. And I'm about to launch a full bootcamp on personalization, so stay tuned for that. Anyway, that's it. That's all I wanted to tell you. I do want to remind you to that the on-demand version of this interview will be available real quick right after we're done with the interview, probably about an hour. So stay tuned for that, and you'll get it at headlesscreator.com, or you can get it at Apple Podcasts and all the other places where you get podcasts. Also, if you have any questions, for those of you watching live, type them in the chat, and I'll ask Jamie as we go along. But without further ado, I'd love to bring Jamie in. So let's bring him in. Jamie, welcome.
Hey, thank you. Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
How are you, sir?
Yeah, very well. And yourself?
Not bad. This week is a short week for us in the United States. For those of you watching live and listening on the podcast, it's Thanksgiving week. So, which is hard to believe we're already in Thanksgiving time, almost the holidays. I mean, it's just crazy to believe that, but time is flying.
Yeah, this year has flown by, for
right?
sure.
It's a good year for all people involved in the headless CMS industry or headless industry in general.
Yeah, it moves so fast. There's always something new every day to learn. Yeah, so much is great.
What do you think of 2022? What do you think that's going to be like for people in headless CMSs, headless technologies in general? What's your thought on that?
Yeah, I think maybe it's not next year, but certainly the year after that, we are going to see kind of a consolidation of services. I think there's so many of them now, and they all kind of have their unique way to play, and it's fantastic. But I think we will see kind of consolidation from maybe some of the bigger players, because they rightly so want a piece of what these new cool kids on the block are creating. And I guess it just makes sense to maybe acquire some of that. But I guess we'll see. That's kind of what's been shared at the moment across many kind of thought leaders in the space.
Right.
And it's something which I can resonate with as well.
That's a natural progression, right? I remember way back in the internet, like when the internet got started, way back in the late 90s, right? I mean, there was tons of small companies everywhere coming up with tons of things. And then slowly, some went out of business, a whole bunch got acquired, and then you had these big players. And I think the same thing is going to happen in the headless space. I agree with you 100%. But that's not what we're talking about today, although we could talk for hours on that. I know we had conversations offline, a bunch of that stuff. But real quick, give us your background. How did you get into technology? And
it started out at a very young age. Getting my first computer. It was actually a tiny, or I think it was a Time computer PC back in the day. I think I was like 12 or 13 years old, and the internet was relatively untapped, nothing like what it is today. And the school that I was at, they wanted this website, and I just kind of said, I'll build it. And I had no idea what I was doing. I think at the time I was using either Front Page, or maybe it's even before then with something called Netscape. web builder or something. So I ended up building the website for this school and really started to learn a lot about CSS and HTML. And there wasn't much JavaScript back then. But yeah, I kind of just learned to explore doing that. And then as time went on, I really enjoyed this. I started to then at school teach people how to do this and share with them some of the findings that I'd done, moved into kind of networking. I went to do a degree in what was it, web development and management, I think at the time. And really they were telling me stuff that I'd learned when I was like 12 or 13. So I just started to look for a job. And yeah, landed a job as a software engineer. I worked at Apple briefly as a genius, so still very kind of connected around technology. And I was a full stack engineer at several companies, and worked a lot with Node or Ruby on Rails at the time. Did a bit of Python, then moved kind of towards JavaScript and what we've got today. And over the last few years, been working more mainly with developer relations, whether it be documentation, content creation, and all that fun stuff.
Very cool. Now you call yourself a full stack developer. Do you have a preference between front end and back end, or?
I do enjoy more back end than front end. I guess people can't see the mess you create on the back end. Whereas if you do something on the front end, people are going to be judging you.
Very good. I love that. I love that totally. So, what got you into GraphQL? And by the way, you have a YouTube channel which we're gonna put in the show notes. Maybe you can mention that real quick. But what got you into GraphQL, and what got you into starting this YouTube channel? Which, by the way, I highly recommend everybody should go check it out, because I watch it every time you release something. I'm like, yeah, something else to learn.
Oh wow, awesome, thanks. Yeah, GraphQL is interesting. I think when I was working as a software engineer at this company, we had maybe 12, 13 different kind of microservices going on, and they were all doing different parts of the stack. Like someone would place an order that would go through a service, then maybe it was then kind of packed and picked in the warehouse, then that would be sent somewhere else for notifying the customer that it was on its way. And we had all of these different services kind of talking to one another. And I built this system to kind of manage all of that, and there was a lot of kind of background jobs going on to process stuff. And we were noticing kind of huge latency between these services. We were asking, it was all built using REST, and we kind of asking a lot of these different services for data. So I just kind of, at the time, started hearing a lot of things about GraphQL. And there was a company at the time called GraphQL, and they deserved tremendous praise in what they did very early on in the GraphQL days. They built not only kind of a full stack tutorial website, but they dedicated a lot of kind of videos on YouTube, which I imagine are still popular today. And they devoted a lot of their time into pushing this thing. So I kind of just picked it up, started to use their kind of tool. And the reason why I mentioned we had all these microservices is I thought, well, couldn't GraphQL be an abstraction on top of this? And back then, that wasn't really something which was used too much. There was certainly not any tooling like we have today. But back then, I was beginning to think, could I migrate the services we have now into at the time the GraphQL implementation, and just GraphQL more generally, and only ask for the data we need, and kind of have smaller clients that are talking to each other, reducing that latency and being a bit more predictable, I guess, and type safe.
Yeah, definitely. So, well, you touched a lot upon, because we're gonna talk a little bit of an overview of GraphQL for those that are not very familiar with GraphQL. So you've touched on some of the benefits, and we're going to get into more detail on those. So why don't we start out with, in general, describe GraphQL, and how is that different than REST? And is REST dead? Because many people ask that, right?
I'm so tired of hearing that.
Right.
And I think anybody that works in GraphQL is tired of hearing that, because they are kind of similar in some ways, that there's a specification going on, and there's a way to do GraphQL and REST, and they're two different kind of contracts. GraphQL is kind of this, and I'm going to butcher the explanation here, but in my opinion, it's a way to kind of declare declaratively ask for data in a structured, type-safe way. It's a query language for APIs, and it's something which you can kind of build a schema and a specification for, and that kind of defines what queries and mutations can be ran, and all of the fields and the types of that. So you could have a schema that's built up of fetch all users, and those users could have IDs, names. But if you were to retrieve that through a typical traditional REST endpoint, you just get that data back. You've got no idea whether that data is going to be an integer, a string, a Boolean, float, whatever. With GraphQL, that's typed ahead, so you know when writing those queries what to expect back. So yeah, it's more of just kind of a type system, really, which is cool.
So we shouldn't be asking REST or GraphQL. Or should we?
I think it's an important discussion to be had. There's a lot of enterprises today who have all, a few years ago we had all these kind of microservices that kind of just exposed REST endpoints or various other kind of layers. Today we have something similar with GraphQL, where we've got all these different kind of GraphQL microservices and maybe some overarching gateway or federated layer on top of all of that can then communicate internally to resolve the data you want. So I think it just comes down to preference on what you kind of want to offer. Is this something you as a business will kind of expose to customers? If it is, that's maybe something to have a discussion around. Are all of my customers aware of GraphQL? Is it worth investing in GraphQL, or should I just continue to use REST because they're using that? My team hasn't got to relearn, retool, and my customers get the APIs, and again, they don't have to relearn and retool. So yeah. I think it's a discussion to be had.
So let's talk about overfetching and underfetching, right? Let's take that by example. So we have, one of the things I've heard a lot about REST is that it's too tied to a front end. And what we mean by that is, let's say we have a user screen and we have a user object, right, that returns all the information about a user. And in that screen, you want to display all that information. But in a separate screen, you just want to display the first name and last name. REST will return everything about it, or you have to create a new endpoint that says only return certain things, where GraphQL, you don't. So can we address that and talk about what is overfetching and underfetching? I kind of gave an example there, but...
Yeah, so this idea, GraphQL by default will just return what you ask it, so it's underfetching data. If you ask for all users and just their ID, GraphQL will just return the user's ID. Traditionally, in a naive REST approach, you would make a GET request to a REST endpoint to fetch all users. That would return an array of all of the objects. If you're lucky, that might be paginated. There could be some filters on there, but you would get everything, and you might not need that. And like I said before, that data could be built up of strings, integers, floats, booleans, and you kind of just need to know what that is to work with it. So hopefully that addresses your question on the underfetching and overfetching. REST, you get everything, in GraphQL, you get what you want.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. And I guess the reason this was made was really, obviously Facebook created this, right? And it was done mainly for mobile, right? Because mobile, you're limited on, at least back then, limited on bandwidth, and you only want to get what you want to get as opposed to get everything, right?
Yeah, I think obviously Facebook at the time, when they kind of came up with this, maybe 10 years ago now, they had a lot of scaling problems, everything right. From, live comments, live likes, the feed, messages, a ton of different things they needed to kind of be interactive and in real time. So they kind of came up with this idea, and you can find videos online kind of talking about why they built this and how they kind of approached it. There's actually a documentary on this from the three creators, which is really good. But yeah, initially created there, but I think it kind of split from Facebook itself. I can't remember when, maybe it's 2017, 18, maybe it's later than that, with having this foundation now of people that's built up of members that can contribute and kind of steer the project. So change licenses and ownership, really, which was really great to see. It's no longer a Facebook thing, but it's now more of a community committee-led thing.
Well, now you have frameworks supporting it natively, like Gatsby, let's say, for example. So how are frameworks using GraphQL?
Yeah, Gatsby is an interesting one. They kind of re-implement GraphQL on their data fetching side, as far as I'm aware. That's still a thing. So you have all of these different source plugins which determine data, and then they kind of build data based off that. Now, it's a good and bad approach, I think. I haven't used Gatsby for a number of years now, but when Gatsby builds its type system, unless you tell it what the types are, then it'll just infer that, oh, I've got a string, this field is a string. Now, Gatsby does kind of give you an escape hatch for that. You can type, you can type those APIs, or if you're using kind of a native GraphQL plugin, I think that's a bit more strict around the types. Those kind of come with those plugins, which is really cool. But Gatsby for a long time was an introduction to GraphQL to many developers. People were using Gatsby. It was this, and it still is a very popular front end framework. Mm-hmm. And at the time, it was the introduction to GraphQL to many people, and this is where a lot of people started with GraphQL. And even today, people that I talk to that are using GraphQL, they've only ever used GraphQL within Gatsby. So I think that's been a significant contribution to the ecosystem and to the adoption of GraphQL.
Yeah, definitely. So is GraphQL tied to any particular language or protocol, or is it pretty much agnostic?
Yeah, it's pretty agnostic on both fronts. Obviously, HTTP is the preferred way for a lot of people, right. But you can use it in other protocols. We've got things like WebSockets, WebSockets, and more traditionally, we've got server-side events with that. So in a GraphQL subscription, for example, you can say, okay, well, we're going to communicate through WebSockets or server-side events, and basically that's just two-way channels and one-way channels of data flowing. There's tons of stuff going on there, which is really, really interesting.
Yeah. Well, let's jump into some of the details of GraphQL for those that aren't familiar. These were asked through Twitter, so I'm just going to throw some terminology for you, and you can define them. Just give us a quick overview of them. Yeah. But let's start with like enums and interfaces. Maybe you can explain what are enums and interfaces with regards to GraphQL.
Yeah. I think if we talk about the general GraphQL schema, that could help here. So yeah. GraphQL schema is something which, if you are building in a GraphQL API, you would define a schema that's built up of all of your queries and types and mutations and subscriptions and many other things. Inside of that schema, we have things like types, which are type user, and a user will have an ID, which is a field, but that ID field will be of a type or a scalar. ID or string or integer. Interfaces, I like to think, interfaces as an abstract type. So imagine you have a vehicle. A vehicle would be an interface name. It would have some properties on there, like number of wheels or has an engine or whatever. And then you would have other things like a truck, a car, a lorry that would implement that vehicle, and they would kind of have that. So that's basically an integer, interface. Yeah. And then that can be built up of integer strings and stuff. Enumerations